Today's video is brought to you by Morgan & Morgan, America's largest injury attorney law firm, ready to fight for you. When dealing with the consequence of injury, sometimes it can feel like you have no options and that receiving proper compensation just isn't plausible. But Morgan & Morgan is here to fight for you. Did you know that proper representation from a lawyer is said to gain on average 3 times more compensation than fighting a case on your own? With 800 attorneys in 49 different states, covering a major range of specialties and expertise, Morgan & Morgan will fight to get you the compensation you deserve. And the best part, Morgan & Morgan operates using a no-win, no-fee basis to put your mind at ease while you focus on getting justice. If you're interested in what you hear, check out Morgan & Morgan for yourself by clicking the link in the description of this video, or using your phone, you can dial #LAW. That's pound 529, or visit www.forthepeople.com to get started on receiving the compensation you deserve. Italian-American crime groups have been extensively and continuously involved in drug trafficking in the United States despite their unwillingness to engage in it. U.S. Department of Justice, the Office of Justice Programs, an official website of the United States government, published 1987. La Cosa Nostra has claimed its moral rectitude or righteousness and honor in relation to drug trafficking, but these statements represent moral posturing and efforts to maintain false self-images. Quotes from the U.S. government in relation to drug trafficking in the Mafia. Narcotics Trafficking in the American Mafia, The Myth of Prohibition, published 1992. Numerous books assert that the Mafia long had a prohibition against engaging in narcotics trafficking, either for reasons of morality or else because of the public stigma attached to drugs. In reality, there are many problems with the belief in voluntary abstention, the mythical nature of internal prohibition, and the far different reality will be illustrated for you in this video. Dating back to the 1920s, there's been evidence the mob has been involved with selling drugs from Lucky Luciano to Meyer Lansky, and in later years, the Bonanno and Genovese families were known to be heavily involved in narcotics trafficking. Since then, many more members of LCN have also been linked to drug dealing, including some of the most infamous and prominent players in the Mafia over the years, such as Sammy The Bull Gravano, Angelo Ruggiero, Roy DeMeo, Anthony Gaspipe Casso, Gerard Gerry Pappa, Gene Gotti, Eddie Lino, Vito Rizzuoto, Gerlando Sciascia, Joe Massino, and although it's never been proved, John Gotti has even been accused of being part of a major heroin trafficking operation, despite there being an alleged ban on drugs, which is said to have been put in effect in 1946. There's different accounts of where the meeting took place and who voted for and against the edict against narcotics. One version of the story is that the bosses of the commission at the time, such as Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Joe Bonanno, Joseph Profaci, and others met in Havana, Cuba to discuss various business interests when they decided to take a vote on if the mob should continue to sell drugs. But in Joe Bonanno's son Salvatore's book, Bound by Honor, A Mafiosi Story, he claims his father had informed him that the real anti-drug edict came about during a secret conclave on a yacht in Miami with the bosses of the commission, where some of the, quote, more liberal bosses like Vito Genovese and Thomas Lucchese wanted to vote to allow drug dealing, while the other bosses like Joe Bonanno, the Gambino family, and the Profaci Colombo family wanted to vote against it, according to Salvatore. Ultimately, it would end with the men allegedly agreeing to put a ban on all narcotics trafficking, or so it's been said. In later years, on a bug recording in the home of Gambino capo Angelo Quack Quack Ruggiero, while being visited by Gambino associate Eddie Lino, the men were caught discussing a drug deal about to go down, and Lino, who was on his way to becoming a full-fledged member of LCN, asked Ruggiero about the ban on drugs out of concern of being caught, being that both Ruggiero and Lino were heavily involved in the Babagna business. Ruggiero explained to Lino that the commission was split on what the consequences should be if a member of the Life was caught selling drugs. He stated anybody who was pinched with drugs from 1962 on never ever gets made, to which Lino responded, "Is that official?" Angelo continued, The ruling commission was split 2-2 on the issue, with the Gambino and Colombo family voting in favor of the ban, and Lucchese and Bonanno families voting against it, also stating that the Genovese family was uncertain. Angelo went on saying, quote, "The bosses were very skeptical about members who were caught selling drugs, saying, that guy got pinched with drugs and he's out of it now? What do they got, a fucking rat?" Paraphrasing the paranoid thinking of the old-timers. Lino responded, "That kills me, isn't it sickening?" Ruggiero replied saying he was once busted with drugs, to which Lino stated, "Who said nice guys can't work?" Although it's unknown what drug bust Ruggiero was referring to. This conversation alone shows how the alleged ban on drugs wasn't exactly enforced, despite how the commission tried to make it look. That wasn't the only conversation about selling drugs that would be picked up on the FBI bug in Ruggiero's Cedarhurst, Long Island home, incriminating multiple members of John Gotti's Burton Crew, including his brother Gene Gotti, and one of the Gotti Crew's biggest heroin suppliers, Bonanno Captain Gerlando Sciascia, aka George from Canada. In this video, I'll get into some of the conversations and will also give you detailed descriptions of some of the other major players' operations who were involved in the drug game. Being that all the LCN families worked together to bring in as much money as possible, you'll see that a lot of these men were connected in one way or another, in terms of importing, supplying, and selling different drugs, mainly including high-end marijuana, heroin, cocaine, and quaaludes. According to Anthony Casso in his book Gaspipe, Confessions of a Mafia Boss, upon turning government informant, he divulged that he was responsible for an international drug trafficking operation that would generate millions of dollars, implicating not only him and the Lucchese family, but members of the other LCN families as well, such as Gambino members Sammy The Bull Gravano and Roy DeMeo, as well as his vicious crew of psychotic killers. Genovese member Gerard Gerry Pappa, and many others who would be accused by Casso, one man being the infamous Teflon Don, who Casso claims had been working with him in the dope game for years. Casso ran a sophisticated drug smuggling and distribution operation running from South America to the U.S., making him responsible for a major portion of drugs coming into the East Coast of the United States, claiming he was getting away with it despite the narcotics ban because it was all off the record, and because he was kicking up so much money, the bosses didn't ask questions, although they truthfully knew. The so-called meeting where the bosses put a ban on drug dealing, in reality, was a meeting to put a ban on openly dealing and admitting to selling drugs, in order to trick the public and the government, and in order to create plausible deniability. Members were taught never to speak about drugs to their bosses, and to keep everything among the capos, soldiers, and associates. And in some cases, the families even had designated associates who were purposely not made so they could handle the dirty work without having to incriminate the whole family or LCN as a whole, and so the bosses or captains didn't have to answer for any allegations regarding the narcotics business. One example of this was Salvatore Ruggiero, the brother of Gambino capo Angelo Quack Quack Ruggiero, who was a captain in Gotti's crew. Salvatore was a major player in the business, supplying the crew with millions of dollars worth of dope for years, until his death in 1982, where he died in a mysterious plane crash with his wife Stephanie, which you can watch in my video, Gotti Crew Millionaire, Fugitive, and Drug Supplier, Salvatore Ruggiero Dies in Mysterious Plane Crash. Link will be in the description for a detailed description of this story. Other examples of this are some of the Mafia farm teams, which were made up of younger, up-and-coming gangsters who in most cases were off-the-record associates of the five families, like the Giannini Crew, the Bay Parkway Boys, the Bath Avenue Crew, the East Harlem Purple Gang, who were responsible for flooding New York City streets with a colossal amount of heroin over the years. Before I describe Anthony Casso's drug operation, where he claimed Sammy the Bull was his best customer, moving more dope than Casso's other biggest clients, Roy DeMeo, Gerry Pappa, and also Jewish gangster Burton Kaplan, just to show that the ban on drugs had in no way slowed the Mafia's involvement in narcotics, here's a small list of just some of the Mafia's biggest drug busts over the years. The French Connection case. The Pizza Connection case, where 18 men were indicted for distributing $1.6 billion of H and Coke throughout the Northeast and Midwest using pizza parlors. The 1983 trial indictment against Gene Gotti, John Carniglia, and 10 others, where they were convicted of heroin trafficking, with Carneglia and Gotti both receiving 50-year sentences. Operation Heat, where former big-time H supplier and Bonanno member Matty Madonna was caught selling millions of dollars worth of kilos to Nicky Barnes. That's just a very small number of cases where the mob has been busted dealing drugs. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics came into existence in 1930 under J. Edgar Hoover to be run by Harry Anslinger, during the time the Mafia in New York was in its prime. Because of the prohibition on alcohol, which lasted from 1919 to 1933, the Italian immigrants who made up what is now known as the American Mafia were able to capitalize on the demand for alcohol by smuggling alcohol into the country and running nightclubs and speakeasies to sell the alcohol for major profits. Rum running and alcohol smuggling would be some of the first documented accounts of the Mafia smuggling illegal substances into the country. But the Federal Bureau of Narcotics would also be the first major law enforcement agency to recognize the Mafia's involvement in the heroin trade, tracing its roots as far back as 1914, following the Harrison Narcotic Tax Act, which was an act passed to criminalize doctors who were prescribing opiate addicts medically with heroin, morphine, and codeine, taking away the doctor's ability to prescribe opiates strictly for the purpose of maintaining addiction, thus creating a black market for opiate addicts who are now forced to turn to the street to feed their habit. The Mafia, now seeing the demand for opiates, began setting up morphine labs. In a 1935 newspaper article, a chemist in the Bronx was arrested after his lab blew up, where he was refining morphine and pressing it into tablets with the pill press machine to sell on the street for the opiate addicts, who in most cases weren't your average junkies on the street. A lot of these men were working, middle-class people who weren't interested in getting their drugs in powder form, but were used to the medicalized pill form they had been receiving. That's just one of the first documented cases of the Mafia's involvement in drugs, but pressed pills weren't by any means the mob's only way of turning narcotics into a profit. Lucky Luciano was born in 1986 in Sicily and migrated to New York City in 1906. By 1916, Luciano would serve 6 months in jail for selling dope to an undercover. It's said that in the early 1930s, after Luciano had become one of the most powerful members of the commission, the mob became part of a sophisticated international crime syndicate, which began manufacturing and trafficking heroin in response to the lack of pharmaceutical heroin from the black market. The majority of the H being bought into the U.S. at the time was said to be from the poppy fields in the Golden Triangle, including the countries of Thailand, Burma, and Laos, and then processed in labs in China. But throughout the years, other known places the Mafia was said to have transported their drugs from was places like Asia, France, Italy, Afghanistan, and Canada. Anthony Gaspipe Casso admitted to not only running a major drug operation, but also pointed his finger at Sammy the Bull Gravano, telling the FBI that Gravano was one of his best customers, a claim which Sammy the Bull always denied and continues to deny to this day. Casso told the agents they had devised a scheme to import huge amounts of quaaludes, marijuana, and heroin from South America to the eastern seaboard by converting shrimp trawlers to hold the product. According to Casso's book, Gaspipe, Confessions of a Mafia Boss by Philip Carlo, when Gaspipe had agreed to become a federal informant, he mentioned that Sammy the Bull was one of his best customers, and they stopped him and told him they didn't want to talk about that right now. They stonewalled him and threatened him with solitary confinement because it didn't align with the information Gravano had supplied to the FBI when he flipped and became an informant. In other words, either Sammy was lying to the FBI about his involvement, or worse, the feds and prosecutor John Gleason were covering it up for him to make a more effective witness against their target and Gravano's former boss, John Gotti, as well as others. Gravano, who was the star witness for the feds in at least 12 trials, would go on to leave the witness protection program and be arrested for running a large-scale ecstasy operation in Arizona and sentenced to 20 years, sort of solidifying Casso's claims that Gravano was involved in the drug business. Not only was Sammy the Bull arrested for the ecstasy ring in Arizona, but so was his wife, son, daughter, and daughter's boyfriend. During the time period that Casso was supplying Sammy the Bull with product, temperatures were at an all-time high between the Gambino family being led by John Gotti and the Lucchese family being led by Gaspipe through his front boss Vic Amuso, because of the unsanctioned Paul Castellano hit, as well as the botch hit on Gaspipe that led back to Angelo Ruggiero, which caused a lot of back and forth hits and hit attempts between the two families, although neither side could prove it was the other behind the attacks. Despite the ongoing war that was brewing between the two families, according to Casso, he reached out to a mutual party and set up a sit-down at La Tavola in Fort Hamilton Park in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, to discuss their beef, but more importantly, to discuss the heroin business. Because tensions were so high between Gotti and Casso, the meeting was set to only include two men from each family, the boss and underboss, Vic Amuso and Gaspipe, and Gotti and Sammy the Bull. With both parties on edge, Casso claims both sides were strapped, locked, and loaded, knowing what each other was capable of and that blood could be spilled at any moment. Casso claimed that he and Gotti had been moving Babania together for years off the record, and now that the two were both leaders of their respective families, he knew if they worked together, they could literally take control of the United States heroin trade. These claims that Gotti was involved in the H business have never been proved, despite law enforcement's greatest attempts, and Gotti has always maintained that he strictly was against the selling of drugs and had absolutely no part of it. It's said the meeting, which started off with tension and animosity, lasted 3 hours, and by the end, after discussing business and so-called rumors about hit attempts against each other, the two sides were joking, laughing, and reminiscing about old times as if everything was fine, although they both knew better. This meeting would come up later after Gravano began cooperating, and when asked about it in open court, Gravano would repeatedly deny the meeting ever took place in order to distance himself from being a drug dealer. But Sammy's lie eventually came back to embarrass all of the Justice Department, including the Attorney General, the prosecutor John Gleason, and everyone else under them representing Team America in the trial against Gotti, when the FBI proved he was lying. Despite Sammy's claims that he wasn't involved in the H business and that the meeting never took place, it just so happens the FBI was staked out across the street and took pictures of all four of the men exiting La Tavola together and going their separate ways, proving Sammy the Bull to be a liar and giving some credibility to everything Casso had been saying. After Casso was made in 1974 at the 19th hole Christy Tick Social Club, by 1975, Casso secretly owned 4 shrimp trawlers and a private 707 cargo jet. The trawlers would pick up shipments of marijuana and cocaine in Colombia and take the boats north through the Atlantic Ocean into different inlets in Far Rockaway, Queens, which Casso scoped out where they would be unloaded. The operation became so lucrative that he had to buy a bigger warehouse on Kings Highway in Brooklyn and purchase more trucks to transport the loads that were coming in. Gaspipe kept a safe distance from the drugs and would pay people to take the risks. He built a strong relationship with the kingpins in Colombia by keeping his word and making sure his cash was always correct. Casso's clientele, who purchased the most drugs and were his best customers, was said to be Roy DeMeo, Sammy the Bull, Gerard Gerry Pappa, and Burton Kaplan. DeMeo's crew, consisting of Joey Testa, Anthony Center, Freddie Denome, Patty Testa, Henry Borelli, Chris Rosenberg, and Joseph Guagliamo, a.k.a. Dracula. Roy DeMeo and his vicious crew of psychopathic killers would move tons of marijuana every month, bringing in massive amounts of money every month, mostly in $10 and $20 denominations. Gaspipe set up a contract to wash the money with a man named Mario, who worked in an armored truck depository on Staten Island's Old Richmond Road. Casso said he would bring Mario in $5 million in small bills, which he would replace with $5 million in brand new shrink-wrapped big bills, which came in $10,000 packets and were issued by the Federal Reserve. DeMeo would receive the drugs from Casso on consignment and was said to always pay Casso on time with no issues. And just like DeMeo, Sammy the Bull was also said to receive his drugs on consignment from Casso and always paid his debts on time with no issues, and the two were said to have developed a very close relationship. Casso's original operation involving the shrimp trawlers would be busted after a mob wannabe named Paul Bennett, who Casso hired to rig stash boxes on the drug transportation vehicles, was busted selling 10 pounds of marijuana. With the information Bennett gave authorities, the Maritime Police and Coast Guard would be alerted, and on Casso's next run, his crew would be busted with $5 million or 20 pounds worth of high-end marijuana called wacky weed, while returning to New York from Colombia aboard a 57-foot trolley named Terry's Dream. Upon pulling into the inlet in Far Rockaway, Queens to dock and be met by an unloading crew in 4 trucks, Casso's guys would be surrounded by cops and federal agents while unloading the 50-pound bales of weed into their trucks, although Casso himself wasn't present. Casso would quickly find out from one of the crooked agents in his pocket that Bennett was responsible, and he would put a hit on him, giving the contract to Roy DeMeo, who would shoot him dead while he was walking out of his front door on Avenue N and East 42nd Street. DeMeo was quoted saying, "That fucking rat, my pleasure," upon being given the hit. Not long after the captain who would drive Terry's Dream on the runs and his son would be murdered for knowing too much and being suspected of talking with the feds. The son was allegedly shot and buried alive in the Fort Lauderdale Everglades on 595, something Casso called street justice. Following that bust, Casso would reorganize his operation and continue to roll in millions of dollars for himself and all the other gangsters in Cosa Nostra who were tight with him. It's said at his peak, Casso was spending $30,000 a week on clothes, food, alcohol, homes, cars, and gifts for his wife. Bringing in the kind of money he was, Casso would be one of the most powerful gangsters of not only his time, but in the history of the American Mafia as a whole. Another one of Casso's best customers was Gerard Gerry Pappa, who Casso says he would front dope, coke, and weed, which, like Gaspipe's other clients, would pay him on time with no issues. A Jewish gangster named Burton Kaplan was another one of Casso's clients who he fronted massive amounts of product. But unlike the other guys, Kaplan had a bad gambling habit and would sometimes come up short or late on payment. But because he knew the money would eventually come in, Casso was said to have taken it easy on him. With all these guys plus others moving tons of product through Casso, it's safe to say he was supplying most of the East Coast. Although drug dealing was still considered to be a cardinal sin in Cosa Nostra and could easily earn you a death sentence if the bosses decided to act on it, all of the family still had captains, soldiers, associates, and even bosses moving drugs, even though they acted as if they had no idea what was happening. Just covering these couple accounts of members of the 5 families who are running sophisticated, large-scale drug operations, I think it's safe to say that this video demonstrates that the Mafia's so-called ban on drugs was no more than a farce. The no drug dealing edict in the Mafia was more simply a message to mobsters that if you're going to sell drugs to make money in that life, be willing to stand on your own and be aware that if you are caught, it could come with a steep penalty. In other words, do what you gotta do, but be smart about it, and don't bring anyone else down around you. Although history has also proven that in most cases, when men in life or in general are looking at any substantial amount of time, they can and will flip on their friends and even their own family members in some cases to get themselves out of going to prison. Since the beginning of the Mafia in America, drugs have always been big business, even though members of that life would like you to believe that that isn't the case. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would like to show support, please like and subscribe. Feel free to drop a super thanks donation in the comments section below. You can also show support by joining the Wise Guy TV family for just $2.99 a month, or donate to Wise Guy TV Cash App or Venmo. Thank you for your support.